Hi, I'm Alphonso, and welcome to the series, The Indian in Me, where I interview people about their stories and about their identity. So, underneath, you're going to see a subscribe button. Please subscribe to this and leave a comment because we would like to hear your stories too. And if you visit our webpage, theindianinme.com, and the link is also in the notes below, please share your story with us as well. Hey, Jeff, welcome.
Andre.
Welcome to our interview.
Hey, listen, is it okay if I say cousin brother?
You can say whatever you want.
You're my cousin brother, aren't you?
Yeah, you are my cousin brother.
What does cousin brother mean?
Well, in India, the sense of family is a bit more extended than our typical nuclear family reaction. So when they talk about a cousin brother, it's actually that cousins are much closer into the fray in the proximity of life than it is, say, in Western civilization, so to speak.
Well, that'll do. You know, I don't think we were cousin brothers when we were growing up.
No.
Because you were just a little baby.
That's right.
And now you're kind of catching up. So
I will never catch up, Jeff.
But I mean in maturity.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
So cousin brother is a better fit than cousin. I think when we were growing up, I considered you as my cousin, my little baby cousin.
Baby cousin.
So I'm in my 75th year.
Wow.
Now that's very good, isn't it, to say you're in your 75th year? And I think I've always said that. And people correct me, especially my wife, Dara, who's Australian. She says, no, you're 74. And I said, no, I was 74 last year. Like that's I'm now in my 5th year.
Yeah.
And she said, well, that must be very Indian. And I think it is.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I've kind of retained as part of my sort of cultural identity, is just the way that I count my age.
Yeah.
I mean,
you're on your 75th tour around the sun.
That's right. So that's a good start. I'm in my 75th year. That's very Indian of me.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get started, Jeff, if that's okay. Yes, we have started. That was the informal start. Now we go to the formal start. So I have a bunch of questions which I'm really curious and interested in finding out about you. So I'm going to start off and just open it pretty broad, Jeff. And the question is, tell me the story of Jeff. Tell me about your story so far. Feel free to share as much or as little as you want. What is the story of Jeffrey Knight?
My earliest memories are growing up in Calcutta. And, I don't have memories from kind of very early childhood, but I do have memories of maybe a 5-6-year-old Jeffrey. Our house was filled with people. When I say filled with people, my parents seemed to kind of collect quite a lot of people. I think later on in life, I identified them as the servants. But in my early life, I never regarded them as the servants because the cook and his wife, and they had 2 boys, were more or less like part of our family. I think especially one of the boys was very kind of brotherly to me. And it's only after I grew up and went to school that I realized that those people were our servants. Isn't that incredible? So, and my other early memory was of cousins, not you because you were the baby, but the Hannahs, my cousins, the Hannahs, they lived over the road from us. Now we were 3 levels up and they were 3 levels up. And my memory is my cousins in the balcony of this other house, but we would converse. And so it was like a friendship, but there was a whole street between us. Isn't that incredible? And we used to do a lot of things together. The kind of things that come to mind immediately are going to church. I think that was something special. And I think being Christian in India uh, we were a minority, but yet I think church was something about our identity that was just so strong. And I'm not sure whether it was maybe the English influence, but we seem to be um, set apart from the general Indian because we had this kind of Christian identity. And going to church was such an important part of that. We seem to spend a lot of time going to church, especially my memories as a young child. And with cousins, parties, lots of parties. I think that your mum, Barbara, was famous for her parties. So I remember coming to the parties at your place, and you had this huge veranda, do you remember? And a great
Yes,
big dog.
I do.
And my very, very, very vivid memory of those parties, and I've asked you this question before, was Barbara's celery paste sandwiches. They're just amazing. I can still taste them. So I'm not sure whether that was an Indian thing, but I've never seen it anywhere else in the world. And of course, the other very Indian thing was the food. My father, George, was famous for his cooking. I know we had a cook servant, but for some reason, the servants would wander off sometimes on the weekends, and my father, George, would take over. And he became famous for his skills with cooking Indian food. I think that's something that has carried through to me as a grown man and through our generation. So my two sisters, Patsy, Susan, my brother Stephen, and I, our kind of signature Indian thing is food. We love Indian food. We have these things once a quarter called the siblings dinner, and we rotated at each other's houses. And really, the big excuse is the food. So it's just like full on Indian food. It's just never ending. And we try and outdo each other with Indian, and it's all kind of home cooked. So it's almost like a genetic thing. So I think that's a very, very Indian thing for me. I think then my next set of memories was going to a boarding school in Kurseong in the Himalayas. And that was the same school that you went to. Because that was another cousin connection thing. Like I went to that school because why? Because the Alphonsos were there, Adrian was there, Brian Hanna was there, Richard Johnson was there. So it just seemed to be the right thing to, and Daryl Alfonso. So it seemed to be the right thing to do to go to this boarding school. And I think I might even have inherited some of the clothing because I was like the middle-aged child. And so the Adrian Alfonso blazer and the Brian Hanna blazer, seemed to be handed on. I don't think I ever got any new clothes. I wore my cousin's clothes, their cast-offs. And that might be an Indian thing as well. That, it kind of, you buying something new was a luxury in terms of clothing. So off we went to boarding school. And whilst we were at boarding school, again, the kind of Christian identity set us apart. I know we were a minority because most of the kids that in my the memory of my schooling year were Hindu and Buddhist. There were very few Christians and there were very few Muslims. And it might have been something to do with our teacher, Miss Mary de Cruz. And I still keep in touch with this Mary de Cruz. Now, Mary de Cruz very famously once told me, she said, you, the Christians and the Muslims, are the same thing. So I kind of grew up with this thinking that Christians and Muslims were the same thing. And what set us apart was this belief in the one God. Whereas my friends had like hundreds of gods. So I remember once asking one of the priests, because we were not far from the seminary, and actually this priest happened to be an Australian priest, Aussie Summit, and a good friend of your family. I said to him, now what's going on here? Because like they've got 100 and something gods. How come we only got one? And he said, oh, well, actually, we've got three. I said, yeah, but what's the story? We have one and there's like three three stages or three people in that one. And he said, well, what are they? And I said, well, the Father, the Creator, Jesus, the carpenter, the young man who got killed. And then there's this kind of third, the Holy Spirit. And he said, well, you know what? The Hindus, they've got the Creator. They've got the next one, the young one. I can't remember. I think it was Vishnu and Krishna. And he said, all those other people are their version of the Holy Spirit. So they go to one person for success in education, another person for success in business, and another person for sport or whatever. Whereas we all go to the same person. The poor Holy Spirit is absolutely inundated with Christian demands, whereas the good old Hindu gods, they kind of share it amongst themselves. I think that made a lot of sense to me. So I kind of then became, my spirituality moved from there's Christians and Muslims, we're the same thing, to there's all of us, and we're all kind of some way connected through this belief in a higher order. I think that was a great comfort for me. So when I came to Australia, I think I was 20 when I came to Australia. One of the things that a question that was often asked of me was, so you're from India, how come you're Christian? And so I would tell them that story about, there's lots of people in India, and we've all got different ways of saying the same thing, but ultimately we are all the same thing. We're all talking about the same thing. It's like this something outside of us that influences us. And I think that, to me, that the Indian in me is that almost like a spirituality. So when I read about books on Hinduism, or if I read books on other religions, I kind of make that connection between those beliefs and our beliefs as Christians. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So as you think about, because it takes us to the next question, which is about your identity of yourself, Jeff. So, here you are, a cocktail of Indian religions, Anglo backgrounds, Anglo-Australian backgrounds. So when you kind of look at yourself with this cocktail of ethnicities, if you like, what is your identity of you?
That's a very difficult question. I think that as I was growing up at school, I mean, I was a bit of a nerdy kid, right? And I loved art. I loved to paint. But my teachers thought that was such a waste of time. They said, no, you're a smart kid. You don't do art. You do maths and you do science. And so I kind of got pushed into this thing. And it was almost for me like something foreign. I didn't identify it as something Indian. It was something that some, I don't know, Western people had manufactured and called it a science. Whereas to me, art was Indian. I loved all the beautiful Indian artworks. And now that I've sort of retired 3 or 4 years ago, it's all come back to me. And so I have turned my skill from being like the nerdy scientist to the Indian artist. And for the first year or two of my retirement, I really got stuck into Indian art. I've done a lot of Indian artwork, and it's been such a comfort for me that it's like coming home. It's that Indian in me is being expressed through my art. Does that answer the question partially? Or
Yeah, absolutely. It does.
I love Indian art.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of, so it seems that in terms of your, what stuck with you in terms of your Indian heritage, so to speak, is certainly the cooking from your dad, which is the siblings' dinner and loving curries, your love of art, the spirituality. What are some of the other stories, Jeff, that you could share with us that's kind of stuck with you in terms of your Indian heritage?
Okay. that's I have to kind of think about that. My Indian heritage uh, is a bit confusing because my grandparents, from my mother's side, I didn't really know them. I have very, very sort of faded memories of those two people. But my memories of grandparents were from my father's side. Now, particularly my grandmother from my father's side, a lady called Agnes. Now, she was an Indian looking lady, but she was an English lady. She was a Pommy lady. She was always correcting me on my manners and my pronunciation and how I dressed. And, we'd go and visit her, and then I'd come back home, and my father would say, "How did that go?" And I'd say, "Well, it was so frustrating because, like, it was so different to being with you." My father was very Indian. He spoke about 2 or 3 Indian languages. I mean, he worked in the Indian Railway in the capacity as the chief clerk in their public liability part of administration, and all of the people that he worked with were Hindi and Bengali speaking. So he was fluent in those languages, and I think he kind of impressed me as being such an Indian fellow. And yet his mother was this old Pommy lady. You know what I mean? So my identity, I think, is drawn more from my father's side. I think I found it frustrating to identify with the English side. I know we called ourselves Anglo-Indian, but deep down inside of me, I was kind of Indian Anglo. You know what I mean? It was more Indian than Anglo because my father was such an Indian kind of guy. And I really didn't appreciate it at the time, but since his death, I kind of not just miss that, but I try and channel that. So I think in terms of, what I would like to pass on to my children is that Georginess, is that Indianness, the Indian curry man, and the speaking the different languages and things. I mean, I sometimes say Indian words to them when they talk to me, and I say, "Oh, in Indian, that the correct word is such and such." So, for instance, I ask them to call me Paji. When they say grandpa, I say, "No, no, hang on, I'm an Indian man, so call me Paji." So what's the G? And I think, well, G is like the sign of respect or endearment, and Pa is acceptable, so Paji. That's what they call me, Paji. Sounds a bit like Paji, doesn't it?
I wasn't going to say anything, but I think you're stuck with it.
Hmm.
Well, that's great. It just seems, Jeff, just listening to you, that you have this really strong affinity with your dad, George, Uncle George, right? The sorts of characteristics he had, his love of food, his embracing of India, and stuff like that. Anything else that you want to talk about in terms of what maybe from your mum's side, anything that you've taken?
My mum, who is related to your dad, had a lot of stories about their life. I can't remember my father telling me too many stories about his growing years, but my mother was absolutely full of stories. And I think they spent quite a lot of their life in Burma, didn't they? So quite a lot of the stories were about her growing years in Burma. And there's also stories about her growing years in India in a little town called Asansol. So my memories of my mother were some of the stories. And that watermelon story, which now you've corrected and said it wasn't watermelon, it was something much more dangerous than watermelon. So maybe on this Indian in Me website, there'll be room for us to tell that story one day. But amazing stories. My mother was a storyteller. And I think what I've got out of her is that ability to not just tell stories, but to kind of embellish. I think, my kids, my daughter in particular, often draws attention to, I'm sure you're making that up. And I'd say, no, it's real. They said, well, we have to check this out with somebody else. Because I have this ability to embellish stories. I'm a kind of a weaver and a spinner, and I think in terms of the Indian in me, some of the storytelling that you and others have told, and I've taken notes. What actually comes out in print is like absolutely. Is this what I said? Like, why? There's all this other stuff that you've just made up, and I think that's my mother coming out. I'm channeling her because she would embellish stuff and make story to make it sound much more interesting, and memorable.
So, Jeff, do you remember any story that kind of resonates with you, or you shared with your kids one of your mum's stories that just kind of says it all? Is there anything that you look back at and go, "Wow, that's a great story, mum"?
Well, shall I tell the watermelon story?
If you
It's a
want to, sure, go for it. I think it's a very powerful story,
well,
but go for it.
my my mum, my mum's father, William. Now he lived with us for some strange reason. I remember him as a little child being there in the house with us, whereas his wife, my grandmother, lived in the Hannah household. And so this was the other connection, was this husband and wife speaking to each other across the street on these two balconies. Well, William, again in my memory, was like a doctor. I'm sure he used to examine people and write prescriptions. Now, I mean, maybe I'm making this up, but that was my memory of it. My mother told me the story that he was doing his degree in medicine. He really was, and he had this little baby in the household, Eustace, whom we also knew. But in between William and Eustace were 5 other children. Now, whilst Eustace was the baby at home and William was studying medicine at university, the other 5 children went to the park in her story and consumed watermelon in her story, which you've corrected me and said it wasn't watermelon, it was something else, dangerous. And these children died of cholera. As a result, poor old William dropped out of university. I think it might have been his final year or second last year in medicine, and became the person that raised Eustace. So that story sticks in my mind, that this man who could have been a doctor just suddenly gave up all that because he had this responsibility for his baby brother. And yet, he was still practicing as a doctor. I mean, this only happened in India, that somebody, like finally a medical student, could actually examine people and write prescriptions. I find that absolutely amazing. And so, the thing that I take away from that is this sense of responsibility for family. I will do anything for family, just as William did. Well, he gave up his career to help raise his baby brother Eustace.
Okay, there. That I think there's so much unpacking in those stories, and that in that one story, isn't there?
And you've gone further with the story because you've actually gone and
Yeah,
found grapes.
yeah.
That is incredible.
So maybe the embellishment on both sides of our parents is the truth is somewhere in between over there. Who'll know? Going back to you, Jeff. As thinking back in terms of your life, what are some of the biggest, most important challenges, I guess, that you faced as a child that has kind of made you the person you are today? If you had to maybe think of one or two of those, what would you pick? What would you choose in terms of those challenges that's kind of forged the Jeff Knight we know today?
I think one of the biggest challenges I faced growing up was, as I said, I was a nerdy child, and my cousins, and that wasn't you because you were the baby, but all the other cousins seemed to be like jocks, sporting. They were all into sport. Sport just never made sense to me. Yeah, and that was such a challenge. I was like the nerdy kid with the books. So when it came to Christmas or parties or anything, I always got gifts, as people knew that, the only thing he's going to appreciate is if you give him books. So books have been such an important part of my life. I'm ravenous for books. I'm ravenous for reading. I think even more recently, film, but I much more prefer books to film. And so I think even now, I'm kind of interested in sport, but not engaged in sport. So I'll watch it on television and I get bored very easily. I want to know how it ends. But with the book, I've got to find a room and lock myself in it and devour it and maybe even read it again because I just love reading. So that's a kind of a challenge that kind of helped me.
And
My other
how's that shaped you today, Jeff? So that whole, interest in books and reading, how's that kind of washed over you as you've grown into Jeff Knight on a 75th tour around the sun?
75th year of my life. I'm a member of the library, and I'm probably, might even be the patron saint of our local library because I'm constantly there, getting books out and pestering the librarian and listening to people like you and Richard and others who rattle off book titles, and I write them down. And off I rush to the library and say, "No, I know you haven't read this book, but you've got to get it for me." Now, this might be an Indian thing as well, because the librarian says, "Why didn't you buy it?" And I say, "Well, why don't you buy it?" I think that Indian in me doesn't like to spend money. If I'm going to spend money, it's going to be on something that I'm going to eat. It's not going to be on something that I'm going to read and put back on the shelf. So that's the thing. I love books, but I don't buy them. I borrow them. Is that an Indian thing, do you think, not spending money? Although Indians do spend quite a lot of money, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it I'm not sure that's an Indian thing. But coming back to you, so bookworm, that sort of stuff. So in terms of the Indian in you, right, that's formed and forged over the years, is there anything in terms of, apart from books, which is really important because I know that kind of defines you, but were there any other experiences you've had, either as a child or as an adult, that's galvanized the Indian in you?
I think we've covered the food thing and the books thing. Um, and we've kind of mentioned spirituality, but that is a very, very important part of my life. Being in this Christian country, I suppose you would call it Australia, and I'm part of a church group, and I think we always have been part of that group. But in the last 30 years or so, with the evolution within the Catholic Church, I suppose, and the movement away from, dependence on the hierarchy, the priests, and looking up to these people, I think that we as Catholics have become much, much more empowered, and we can take responsibility now for changes within the church. And so for the last 30 years, we've been part of a group. And actually, this group evolved from a parish in France, and now it's an international movement, where couples, say 6 to 8 couples, and a priest get together once a month, and we just talk about our lives and explore the movements and the changes within the church. And my role in that is to always bring a non-Catholic flavor to the discussion. So when they talk about, something evolutionary in terms of Catholicity, I always remind them, you know what, in India, this has been going for centuries. Like, this is not something new. And then I tell them the story about how this would happen in a Hindu household, how this might happen in a Muslim household. And I think it kind of amazes them because I think for too long, Christians and probably Catholics more than anything else have been exclusive, like they think that the only people that are favored by God, Everybody else, well, they're just there biding their time. But really, everybody else is in the same boat. And I keep reminding them that the stories I tell them are about Hinduism and Islam. So, for instance, recently, I mean, Easter's just gone past. My stories have been about Ramadan and Eid and how we would celebrate that. And you know what? It's the same time as Easter. And the stories are very similar. And people just sort of look at me as if to say, wow, isn't that amazing? But it's just something that I grew up with, you know?
That's
It's
awesome.
the Indian spirituality
Yeah.
stuck with me.
So Jeff, you and me and a bunch of small group of amazing collaborators are part of the Indian in Me project that we're working on right now. So when you first heard about this, what compelled you to say, I want to be part of this? What was it that ignited something in you?
What was it? Well, Richard Johnson, who is another one of my cousin brothers, uh, had his ancestry traced through ancestry.com. And he rang me one day and said, did you know we were like something like 80% Indian? And it kind of struck me as if I kind of knew it, but no one had put it into words. And so he said, do you think we should get together and talk with other people about this? That in fact, we are very, very Indian. And yet we don't celebrate that. And we need to identify much more about the kinds of things that characterize us as Indians living in Australia. Because, I mean, when it comes to syntax, I regard myself as an Australian, but I'm also very strongly Indian. And not so strongly British, even though that Anglo-Indian might suggest that I am. I'm kind of much more Indian than I am British. And so when people ask me nationality, I say Australian-Indian. It's interesting. I kind of leave out the British part. And it also probably comes from the fact that when I first came to this country, and I was, a scientist, a defense scientist, that was my field of study in India. And I got a job doing some research for the Department of Defense, that the chief industrial scientist in that department said, so what's your story? What are you? I mean, you've got a name, Jeffrey Knight, but you've got brown skin. And I said, well, it's kind of, we're Anglo-Indian, we're British, you see. And he said, hang on, you just stop there, he said. In this country, you don't use that word, because if you say you're British, people will regard you as a bit of a nutcase. You tell them you're Indian, and they will look up to you and revere you and think, wow, amazing, smart guy. I think that's a reputation that Indian people have. Well, in the scientific world anyway, is that, wow, we've got to listen to what this guy has to say. He said, don't tell people you're a POM, because they'll laugh at you. Is that amazing? And it's sad in a way, isn't it?
And okay, so that's great. Anything else in terms of this Indian in Me project that is compelling to you?
Yeah, well, so once Richard sold this idea to me, it was interesting but not riveting. But then when he got to the part of reforming this group of people and we're going to be discovering stories, bingo, that was my magic word, stories. I've got to be in this group. So when I dial into these meetings that we have, I've got my pen and paper ready to record the stories. And as they come through, I get so excited because I know that for the next week or so, I'm going to be documenting the story and weaving and spinning stuff into it like you wouldn't believe. So that's the big thing for me. The Indian in me is the stories that people are telling about India. And I love the stories that people tell us, I'm not really certain about this, but this is the story. Like Richard Florey says, my grandparents told the story about something that went on during the riots in India. And I think, wow, that's amazing, because I didn't know about the riots in India at the time of petition. And so now I've spun that into this amazing story. And when I give it back to Richard, he thinks, is that the story I've told you, or are you making this up? So the stories, that is what is getting me. That is what is keeping me in this.
Maybe you're channeling your mum, Pompey Knight, over here, who is an embellisher of stories.
Maybe it is.
So Papa G, Jeff Knight, grandkids, kids, what is the legacy you want to leave for future generations in terms of this whole Indian in me and the stuff we're doing and the stuff you're doing? Well, I mean, what is it that you want to leave for the future generations to hang on to?
I think that my children, my son and my daughter, I want them to know India, and even from a very early age, a lot of our travel took us to India. I made sure that it took them back to India. They were little; they probably don't even remember most of it. But I wanted them to see India. I wanted them to experience the poverty in India. I wanted them to come up with me to the hills in Kurseong and see the places we went to there. Come up to Tiger Hill and look at the sunrise over Kinchinjunga. And they still remember these things. So, that's the legacy I want. I want them to remember India as the place that they have a connection with, not just a place that's a geographical entity, or not just a place that comes up frequently in some television films or movies, but a place that they're connected with. And their connection is through me, because their dad grew up there. And the food, of course. Both my kids love Indian food, and now my grandchildren love Indian food. I have 3 grandchildren, and one of them, the middle one, Remy. I asked her the other day what she was going to do. She said, "Oh, I've got friends coming for lunch." I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm making them parathas and dal." And I thought, wow, that is just amazing. Because one day I went to her place. She said, could I come and visit her for something or the other? And she said, "Can you show me how to make parathas?" This was like going back 2 or 3 years. So it was like a bit of a, master. What's that program on television? The cooking program? Yeah, the chef.
Master Chef.
Master Chef. I said to her, "Okay, this is the Master Chef masterclass. The item today, the challenge today is parathas." And so we made parathas, and she just remembers that so well. And the same girl, Remy, got married last month. And you know what she wanted? She said, "Paji, can you do the henna hands?" No, I'd never told her about henna hands. And so the day before her wedding, I went over to her place. She'd bought, my daughter and she had bought the henna, and I painted her hands. So she got married as an Australian bride with Indian hands. Isn't it amazing? I want to send you a photo of that.
Yes, and painted by her grandfather, the
Yeah,
artist who's got this thing about Indian art.
right, exactly. It just makes so much sense, doesn't it?
Uh, Jeff, is there some wisdom you would like to share with anyone who's watching? Here you are, and as I said, as you said before, the 75th tour around the sun. You've probably collected a lot of wisdom along the way. What's something you'd like to share with people who may be watching this?
Well, and it comes back to DNA. It also comes back to the doshas, which are part of the Ayurvedic beliefs, the Prakriti. People think the DNA is something new, and it's just a new word. But forever, Indians have known that there is this inherent property within us that identifies us. It influences everything that we do. And I think we call it DNA. And so, my message is that you may be in a different geographic location. You may be uh, wealthy, you may be very smart, but deep down inside of you, there is this thing that you can't change. And it's India for me. And some of that has rubbed off onto my grandchildren and my children. And I want that to rub off onto their children. I want the next generation to be making parathas. And I want the brides of the next generation to have hammer hands. That might not happen. But I'm sure that one day someone's going to pick up a wedding album and say, why has this girl got painted hands? And her parents will say to her, oh, it's an Indian thing. Her grandfather did that. Would you like that for your wedding?
You just prompted me to for my legacy, which you mentioned earlier, is to pass on the celery paste. I think I need to pass on the celery paste.
It is an Indian thing. I mean, it might sound like a British thing, but there is nobody on this planet that knows how to make celery paste, except Barbara Alphonso.
And I have the recipe, which I have shared with you.
Exactly. So I use that recipe to make her, and I make it, and people think, what is this? And I tell them it's an Indian thing, just eat it.
Jeff, we're coming to the end of our time. So what is the one question I should have asked but didn't? So this is just basically free ball. Anything you want to share over here about anything you want to say, really?
I think that something that still disturbs me is the poverty. I don't think I will ever get over it. And yet it is a poverty that is alarming for us as Westerners or people who, have accumulated some wealth. I'm not talking about financial wealth, but wealth in terms of career and understanding and education and everything. But yet my experience of the poor people in India is that they were just so, they had a different wealth. They had a richness in the way that they loved the place and that they loved each other. There was a book called The City of God. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have heard of the book, and I have seen the movie.
The author, but it was about a priest, a Jesuit priest, who was sent to India as a missionary to convert these people. And he arrived in India, in a very poor part of India, and the story was about his conversion. So he forgot about the conversion that he came to do, but he became converted into this kind of simplicity, this life that even though there was no wealth, there was such a lot of joy. And that's why it's called the City of Joy, because it was a joy that they experienced. And I hunger for that. I don't think all the money in the world and all the books that I read and all of the smart scientific stuff that's in my brain gives me as much joy as that. When I'm in India, on a tram or on a train, or when I'm walking down the street and there's thousands of people around me, I look into their faces and they're just so delighted.
That's fantastic, Jeff. Well, that's a wrap, I think, in terms of, and it's been really interesting for me because I think I've learned a lot more about you as a person that I never would have, because as cousin brothers, we kind of talk about stuff, but we don't actually sit down and actually talk about stuff. You know what I mean? And I've really loved the hour we've spent together this evening. So just to wrap it up, thank you again, and thanks for watching, everyone. So once again, please click on the subscribe button and leave a comment. We would love to hear your stories as well. Yeah. So please share them on our webpage, theindianinme.com. That's one word, theindianinme.com. The link is below. And I will have some more interviews to share, and I hope you can join us again. So I'm Andre Alphonso. And thanks for watching this interview series, The Indian in Me. See you next time.